In the last session, we have talked about the Kubernetes training as an overview. So what's the goal of the training? So we said that the goal of the training is to enable application developers to deploy distributed application systems. Our scope is narrowed in a way that a simple distributed application system can be deployed. You can do that with arbitrary complexity. So as this course is tailored for beginners, some of the details will be skipped. We then learned that before you can deploy something to a Kubernetes cluster, you also need a containerization of application components. So we looked into containers and in particular to Docker, as this is a tool that helps you to create Docker images locally. We've seen how to push such a container image to a registry. We've learned what a registry is. We've learned what a container image is, and made some simple experiments, including the containerization of a very simple app. Now, this time, in this lecture, we go a bit further. So after the containerization, today is the time to start with Kubernetes. Kubernetes Overview is the first page of the training when it comes to this. So a few remarks on that. There are plenty of ways on how you can approach learning Kubernetes. But in this particular training, I've decided to go with a hands-on approach. Well, we do have theoretical parts, but we do not look into, for example, the deeper architecture of Kubernetes before explaining the application developer perspective. So the didactics of this training is architected in a way that we first look into how does it feel to use Kubernetes from a developer perspective, with a strong focus on the result. So as we've done in the last session, we look into a bit of theory, just enough to understand the outline of, for example, what a container is, and then we try to do little exercises to have practical experience with the technology. This does not mean that the architecture isn't important, and at some point you should look into how this thing works, whether it is Docker or whether it is Kubernetes. Maybe we'll have an additional advanced course at some point. They're all meant for self-study, so even outside of lectures you could just pick up the tutorial and spend some time. If there are questions, I'll be there to answer them. So the point is, we're going through a series of practical little exercises. I'll explain here and there a little bit of the background, so feel free to ask questions if something isn't clear for you. I'll try to explain them. So this is important to set your expectations. We are not dissecting Kubernetes and its individual components, because I think it is more important that you understand what is the goal of Kubernetes and what is the benefit as an application developer. And then if you want to dig deeper, it makes sense to go and look into the architecture. So that being said, in this part of the training, we will continue to dig into topics such as how do you interact with the Kubernetes cluster. In particular, there's the kube control command. It is often pronounced kubectl. I think we'll stick with that name, but there are people calling that kubectl. So all of that is fine. I don't have a particular opinion about this, so I'm using kubectl because it's such a nice word. So we're looking into kubectl, which is a command line tool to interact with the Kubernetes cluster. And we also look into the most important Kubernetes resources. In particular, pods, which is very important, a very central concept in Kubernetes. As in Kubernetes, it is not possible to start a single container without a pod. So the thing that you will schedule, handing it over to Kubernetes to be started, is a pod, not a container. We're looking into replica sets, which is basically a structure that controls pods for stateless applications. So we're looking to replica sets and see how the replica set controller allows to create self-healing pods. We look into deployments, which is a structure above the replica sets, and the structure that is tailored to be used to deploy application systems. So we'll see whether or why these three components or different concepts are necessary or recommendable to be used when deploying applications. We look into Kubernetes services. So when I personally use the term service, I often refer to a data service, such as a database or a message queue or a search or analytics server. But in the Kubernetes world, a service is something different. And we look into what it is and what it is about. We'll also look into ingress, which is Kubernetes word for incoming layer 7 routing, in particular routing requests that come from outside of a cluster to applications inside of a cluster is where ingress is needed. We look into configuration management. So if you don't want to put your configuration in your code, which you shouldn't according to the 12-factor manifest, then you have to store it somewhere. So config maps and secrets are concepts to represent configuration values that will be consumed by your applications, and general whatever you provision could also be a data service at some point. The next chapter, jobs and cron jobs, is about one-off tasks and one-off tasks that need to be run repeatedly. So this is in contrast to the long-running processes such as that of a web service. So when you start a web application, you start it once and you want to keep it running. Whereas, for example, a certain maintenance task, let's say perform some, sometimes you have to perform a script to tidy up something or anything like that you don't want to run as part of your application. So you can describe it as a job, which is basically spinning up a container, executing the code, and terminate the container. And if you want to do that regularly on deployments in the past, you would have used a cron daemon describing a regular task, for example, a program or script, to be executed regularly by using a cron tab or an entry in a cron tab, to be precise. So there's a concept similar to that in Kubernetes, and we'll have a look at that. And then finally, at least for now, there's going to be a presentation of stateful sets. Now, it is important to mention that currently the training is still in progress, and therefore I will make continuous updates to that tutorial. So you will see that the stateful set chapter is still missing. I will add that chapter a bit later during the lecture. All right, so we assume in this part of the training that you are familiar with the basics of containerization, obviously. As I said, the training is built in a way that you'll start with the outline, which means that a lot of these topics, they have way more depth than we will cover in this training. But I think for first iteration of learning how to use Kubernetes, it is important to get the basic concepts and their relation to each other. And then once you have mastered that outline, you can add more depth to it, which is usually done by going into more detailed deployments, for example. So if you have a real-world application with a certain complexity, you will naturally go into more advanced Kubernetes topics automatically. But as I said, could also be the case that we are going to have another advanced class in Kubernetes after that. The goal of the training in basic, as I said, is to deploy a distributed application, which will also be the final exam. I mentioned that I'm still working on the particular description of the final exam, but it's basically a deployment that will use all the concepts that we've covered in the training at different parts. So there will be a few challenges for you to see, and also a chance to see whether you have understood all the material presented here. And if not, well, there's the training. You can always go back and study yourself. I'm also trying to provide links to each chapter. So I'm presenting you the sources that I've used to prepare the chapter, as I'm also a Kubernetes learner. So I've not been using that for, well, let's say 5 years, as I've done with Cloud Foundry, for example. So I'm also considering myself a learner, and so I'm trying to keep track of the sources I've been using. I'm adding them to the tutorial so that at any time you can dig deeper